Hello to anyone who may be listening. Today I will be talking about the connection between our transportation habits here in the United States and how they relate to marginalized communities. I will be giving a brief overview of the history as well as three big picture reasons as to why I think we should start rethinking our transportation habits as a society. An alarming 90% of Americans depend on a personal vehicle of some kind every day, which has led many people to reconsider American transportation and infrastructural habits. However, generational issues that arose from the Federal Highway Act prohibit any effective change. But before I get ahead of myself, where did this problem come from? At the turn of the 20th century, entrepreneur Henry Ford decided to create an automobile via the assembly line, the Model T. This vehicle quickly became a success due to the cheap price and unbelievable utility. From this point on, cars gradually became more and more of an American staple, a symbol of individualism and personal freedom. After World War II, President Eisenhower spearheaded the idea for an international highway which would connect the continental United States. This idea was very popular at the time and was not met by much pushback. So, in 1956, the Federal Highway Act was signed into law, marking the moment where the United States invested its future into the car. Although this was seen as wildly successful, there have been many unforeseen externalities that affect us all every day. The highway allowed people to travel to places they'd never seen before and helped people to develop a greater sense of national identity. But the highway also created a way for people to flee urban areas. These fleeing individuals were mostly white and were headed to either rural areas with now an easier access to urban centers via the highway, or a type of city that was new for the time, suburbs. People moving to suburbs had a picturesque idea of what their life should look like, complete with homogeneous houses and demographics, each with a set wife, kids, and husband, a backyard with a picket fence, and, you guessed it, a car. The car allowed these people to travel and have their cake and eat it too, since these were usually people who depended on the city for work, but didn't want to live there for bigotry reasons. On the opposite side of the coin, marginalized communities were most affected by the Highway Act. Since these communities usually lacked any sort of wealth, vehicles were often out of the picture, leaving these individuals walking or using public transit. To make matters worse, the highway being paved often traveled through inner cities, leaving many communities ruptured to this very day. This isn't from the Highway Act specifically, but you can see in Duluth, the Hillside neighborhood has been ruptured by the 6th Avenue connecting to Masaba. Next time you're in that area, you can see a clear distinction of where West Duluth is and East Duluth is, simply because that road is cutting between the two. This domino effect can be seen from the very beginning with the first mainstream vehicles, which led to newfound demand for government funded roads, which in turn allowed people to drive. This led to improvements in the automotive industry, which led to Eisenhower's investment in the Federal Highway Act, which led to more people driving, spreading out far and wide across the country. This led to higher demand in newer cars that could travel farther distances, and so on and so forth up until today. This is a map of the continental United States and the highway program that has connected everything. You can see that it looks almost like a spider web with how interconnected everything is. So much so that some zones are so full of highways that you can hardly see the land underneath them. Granted, this is just a map and it's a visual representation, but there is proof to back this up as well. If you look at our community that we live in today, Duluth, you can see a massive impact that human infrastructure has had on the natural world. Just looking at an aerial view, you can see just gray density along the side and up here to central entrance, and even the natural areas of green spaces have been cut apart by roads connecting to different farms and other smaller cities. Um, this can obviously become an issue because now that we're so spread up over here, you kind of need to drive to go way up here. Most of the homeless people in Duluth hang out in the main center area right over here and into West Duluth. But that's just because it's very tricky to go anywhere without a vehicle here in the United States. Um, Marginalized communities are the most impacted by car dependence. According to a 2016 study, accessibility is often an issue within disadvantaged areas. This can be attributed to generational social disadvantage, which can include poverty, discrimination, and other systemic inequalities. Another impact of this occurrence is low access to sustainable transportation. This can include personal vehicles, public transport, or generally any way a person travels from A to B. Ironically, impoverished communities are typically located closer to highways or other major infrastructural nodes, despite the difficulty in actually using this infrastructure as a resource. This lack of transportation keeps these communities confined to a certain area since they don't have the ability to find opportunities outside of it. Since these communities are often found near major infrastructural nodes, they're also prone to health hazards attributed to automobile exhaust and overall air pollution. Those who face all three ways that car culture hinders marginalized individuals suffer the triple burden in the automotive world. This slide, I also put a side-by-side picture of the same aerial view of West downtown Cincinnati. This was taken in 1955, and you can see that this community is pretty cohesive, and you can see the rail network down here. But then in 2013, this new picture is the current state. You can see the same rail yard down here, and I'm sure some of these houses are the same, but the entire left part of this community has just been displaced and eradicated from existence, just simply so that this highway can connect through the city instead of around. Because we now live in the area of the internet, marginalized communities have an easier time learning about some of the problems that plague the world, as well as possible solutions. There are some people focused on combating carbon emissions, pinpointing the environmental and personal health issues that would be solved by walkability, while others focus on injustices of opportunity and promoting density to further develop communities and economic prosperity. Either way, walkability seems like a wonderful solution to both problems. The only issue is that walkability is heavily context dependent. Studies done on spurring walkability in a community show that they are much more successful in older, already dense places where people have walked before. These communities also tend to have wealth as well as the ability to make grand changes. For marginalized communities, the resources needed to reorganize neighborhoods, reconfigure automotive transportation, and promote mixed-use developments is completely inconceivable. A study based in Europe found that increasing the quality of life from the bottom up has a positive impact on the entire whole. So that could be what some of our disadvantaged communities may need. As far as communities that do have access to walkability, the infrastructure is often heavily underutilized. As I discussed before, walkability is much easier to achieve in areas with pre-existing walkable infrastructure and a history of wealth. This leads to wealthier individuals having access to this infrastructure, and they primarily use it for leisure activities such as an afternoon walk or a walk to their favorite cafe or something. Although it is positive that they're able to have an active form of interaction within their community, optimal walkability is achieved when active transportation is the primary form of transportation. A study done on the Smart Walk score found that the overall score of an area was misleading. For reference, Smart Walk Score is an online tool used to determine practicality of different forms of transportation in a city, for example, walking, biking, and public transportation. Each of them are graded 1 to 100 with a higher score indicating a higher viability. Although some cities are graded highly for active transportation, actual travel habits are not correlative, meaning that individuals that live in walkable areas usually own a personal vehicle and they use that for their daily priorities instead of walking, as we may assume from the community's high walk score. The same study found that close proximity to needs as well as the lack of resources is a better determination of a person's actual travel habits. If a person doesn't own a vehicle in an area with a low walk score, they will still walk because they have a lack of other options. If a person lives next to work in an area with a low walk score, they will still walk because of convenience. If a person lives in an area with a high walk score but their job is across the city, they will drive. Personal lives and proximity are the main determiners of walkability. The problem is that there's a gap in research of actual solutions to spur walkability. This gap creates issues when promoting walkability since it's unclear on how to even start. Although the steps to walkability are blurry, one thing is for certain: there is a need for change. The majority of people who drive acknowledge a lack of free will in their transportation habits, as 80% of drivers feel they have no other option but to drive. Whether or not people think that's a bad thing is up for debate. Many people love the ability to drive wherever they want, whenever they want, and would probably consider it an attack on their freedom to strip away driving or even shrink the broader car culture. This sort of dependence is the foundation of the omnipresent nature of the automobile. As discussed earlier, the desire to drive creates demand for roads, and roads demand cars to drive on them. This relationship has greatly impeded the success of many minority communities by ripping apart neighborhoods and isolating them from the broader whole, as well as creating a system where resources are required to be able to have reliable transportation. These externalities are coupled with the irreversible effects that cars have left on the natural environment, including the air we breathe and the land we stand on. These problems can never be truly resolved without stepping back and reevaluating our current habits as Americans. While I believe that this is a massive systemic problem that cannot be easily solved, I believe that there are certain steps that can be taken to help mend this historic blunder. As a precursor, I would like to say that electric vehicles and ride-sharing systems make for a good neutral solution since they do mitigate fossil fuel consumption. That being said, neither work as a solution to walkability since they both maintain the status quo. So, I think the first step that could be taken that would be to increase implementation of mixed-use zoning in developments. Walkable communities across the world employ this strategy since this creates reasons as to why a person should walk to begin with. This mixed-use strategy would blend neighborhoods with workplaces, supermarkets, schools, and community centers. They should also incorporate mixed housing that can support many different people at many different price points. These sorts of developments would not only foster economic growth and opportunities, but would also help in creating a more cohesive community. Another step that could be taken towards walkability would be implementing better and broader public transportation for the general public. There should be more of an emphasis on travel options other than personal vehicles, such as more funding to city bus systems to create more efficient transportation networks so that more individuals may use it, or adding tram systems for more set and consistent routes. Even passenger rail between cities would be a great alternative mode for transportation. Reliable alternative modes would be very influential in convincing more drivers to opt out. The last step I would like to point out is defunding automobile sectors in order to restore green spaces from roads and lighten the influence on the average American consumer. This would probably be the most controversial of the three steps, although that doesn't say much, since it would essentially mark the shift away from personal vehicles toward other means of transportation. This would not be very This would not only be very unpopular from avid consumers, but also the mega enterprise of the automotive industry, which has enormous political and economic influence. My presentation has little to no influence on the broader problem, as it is so inconceivably large that it would take much more than this to solve. But I hope that my lecture was moderately informative and that it gives you a new perspective on the world that you and I have to experience every day. If I had one thing that I want you to take away from this, it would be that whether you like it or not, your life and more importantly, the whole world is affected by our travel habits and our acceptance of car culture. One question I want to leave you with is, how would your life be different without a car? Answering this question is your first step to solving the problem. Thank you for listening. That is all. Done with the yappening.